In this lesson, we'll be expanding on the grayscale painting process that we've already explored in the previous assignments. This time we're going to be adding on an additional layer of digital power to our workflow, and that is layers. We're going to use layers to construct our painting in a meaningful way that will make some of our painting tasks a lot easier than they would be otherwise. As always, I'm going to start off with a figure drawing, as I feel like having some kind of structure underneath the clothing always makes my drawings better. Even though the figure is kind of hard to distinguish in the reference, I'm kind of building the structure of my own painting here, rather than trying to copy anything from the reference perfectly. So I'm just drawing something that I think feels good, and I can then add the clothing and details on top. Once I'm happy with the figure, I'm going to lightly erase it out to knock those lines back, and then start loosely describing some of the clothing on top. As I'm doing this, I'm already starting to think a little bit about what kind of layers I'm eventually going to want in this painting. You can start breaking your piece into layers at this point if you want to, but I personally find that if I start splitting up my drawing into multiple layers, I get a much stiffer and less gestural drawing. So I prefer to keep my drawing to just one layer for now, and then divide it into various layers afterwards to get the layer structure that I need. There are certain elements that I need to have a fairly clean drawing established, like the face, hands, bowl, and the skulls on her headdress. Some of the other things, like the fur collar and some of the draping fabrics, I find easier to describe in the painting stage, so I'll leave those very loose and gestural in the drawing and refine them later. I'm also going to be omitting a lot of the smaller details from the drawing, like the dangling beads on the headdress and the chainmail on her veil. These details will be much easier to describe in the painting stage, and I won't have to worry about adding a ton of messiness to my drawing that I then have to separate out later. The more you work with layers and the more comfortable you get with your own process, the easier it will be for you to identify early on which things you really need to cleanly define in the drawing stage and which ones will be more easier to describe in painting. It's different for everyone, so experiment, try different things, and find what works best for you. Once I've finished my drawing, I'm going to establish the most important layer in the piece. For most professional art, the character must always be separated from the background, so I'm creating a new layer underneath my drawing called Silhouette, and I'm going to paint in the edges of all the shapes that compose the silhouette of the character. This will allow me to keep the character on its own layer, and I can later divide that into sub-layers as needed. There's lots of different ways you can do this, but I personally find painting in a silhouette by hand with the brush tool to be the most efficient for me. It gives me a lot of control, and I can get much cleaner shapes than I can with something like the lasso tool, and it's also faster than using something like the pen tool in most cases. I'm not worrying about the interior of the silhouette at all. I'm just describing all of the outermost edges so that I can get a clean selection once I'm finished. After I've painted in all of the edges of my silhouette, I can use the Magic Wand tool to select outside the silhouette. Be sure to select any nooks and crannies like the spaces between the antlers. Once I've got this selection established, I can go up to Select and press Inverse. This will invert the selection that I have, meaning that the character is selected instead of the background. I can then simply fill in the silhouette layer, and this will give me a full opacity silhouette that's cleanly restrained within the outline that I painted. From there I can pop open Hue Saturation and bring this down to a nice gray value. This gives me a great foundation to start building my painting on. I can now do whatever I want with the background layer and never have to worry about it affecting my character on top. Once I've established these layers, I can move forward with my value block in. I'm going to start by establishing the background to give myself context for where the values of the figure need to go, and then, as before, start blocking in some basic flat values to describe the local values of all these various materials. I'm not copying the reference exactly, as I'm trying to make my own painting as always, so you can see there's some cases where I've changed the values of the painting away from the reference, like making the antlers up top fade to a very dark value, which I think reads very nicely over the background. I establish a little bit of my shading here as well, but I'm not getting too into it as the lighting is very soft, so I can describe a lot of this just in the painting stage over top of my flat values. Once I'm done with my value block in, I'm going to group my drawing layer and my silhouette layer into a group, duplicate it, and then merge it together with Ctrl-E. This gives me a single layer with my entire character on it, while also preserving my drawing and silhouette layers in case I ever need to go back to them later. After that, I'm going to start dividing my character into layers that I think will make my painting process easier. There's a lot of different ways you can do this, and I'll show you my two favorites here. For simpler selections, it's easy to just simply use the lasso tool and carefully trace around the outline of the element that you want to separate onto its own layer. After I've made my selection, I can press Ctrl-X to cut that pixel information off of my base layer, and then press Ctrl-Shift-V to paste in place. This is an important hotkey. If you simply press Ctrl-V to paste, it will paste the pixel content that you cut directly in the center of your screen. If you press Ctrl-Shift-V, which is paste in place, this will paste the content where it was before you cut the content. So by using Ctrl-Shift-V, it places the skulls and antlers exactly where they were before I made my selection. I can then rename this layer as I want to be sure to stay organized throughout the entire painting process and move on. When cutting my piece into lots of layers, I like to be sure that the edges have a little bit of overlap so I have flexibility to move things around as needed. So I'm creating a new layer underneath my base character layer and just quickly painting over top of the area that I cut the antlers out of. I can then grab my base layer, hold Shift to select the new layer, and merge them together. Then I will quickly paint out the edge of this transition, and I now have the flexibility to adjust the headdress without having to worry about the cut line appearing as transparency between the two. Another great way to separate out layers is by using Quick Mask. If you press Q with a layer selected, you can use your brush tool to paint a mask. If you paint with black, that area will not be selected. So here, I've simply pressed Q to enable Quick Mask mode, and I'm going to paint over top of the veil that's covering her face. I only need to paint the edge between the veil and the skin. After that, I can grab the lasso tool, select the entire veil, and fill it with black to complete my selection. Now, I can simply press Q, and the content that I've painted has become a selection. I can then go to Select, Inverse, Ctrl-X to cut, Ctrl-Shift-V to paste, and I now have the veil on its own layer. Once more, I'm going to create a new layer underneath my character and paint a small bit of buffer between these two new layers that I've created. So if I ever move the veil, there will still be pixel content of the character underneath it. After painting my buffer, I can merge my character with the buffer layer and then paint out the line work that's creating a little bit of mess on top. I'm going to continue using this process for a few other elements of the character. Deciding which parts of the piece you want to have on their own layer is an organic decision-making process. It's different for every painting that you do, so you'll have to use your best judgment, and the more you practice this, the easier it will become to make determinations about what you want to have separated onto its own layer. I've also very purposefully kept the face on a layer separate from the body because I know I'm going to want to have a layer for the transparent black gauze that drapes behind her face and over her shoulder. So in order to do that, I need to have space for a layer between the two. This will also make it easier to paint the face, as I can easily paint it with a transparency lock and not have to worry about painting over top of the black gauze behind it. A general rule that I like to follow is anything that heavily overlaps another element, such as the front arm that's holding the bowl, I like to keep things like that on their own layer. As you begin to work with more layers, the transparency lock becomes your best friend, so I highly recommend binding it to an easy-to-access keyboard shortcut or one of your tablet buttons. Throughout this entire process, I'll be turning my transparency locks on and off constantly. Whenever I want to paint inside the silhouette of the layers I've created, I'll turn on the lock so I can paint without having to worry about going outside the lines. However, a lot of the layers that I made in my selection process may be slightly imperfect, so I may need to adjust the contour or the silhouette of those layers, in which case I have to turn the transparency lock off to adjust the layer and the silhouette as needed. In terms of the painting process itself, I'm following the same method we've been using up to this point, painting with the brush tool and using the eyedropper to blend. The smudge tool also becomes very helpful in this particular process, as you can use it to soften the edges of certain layers to avoid an overly clean and sterile digital look. Like in the third grayscale painting demo, I'm going to be using a variety of brushes to get different textures on the different materials. I used a soft brush to get a nice softness to the skin, a bristle brush to paint the hair, and some various texture brushes for the other elements. Also, as my painting develops, I often add more layers anytime I think they will be helpful. For instance, this perfectly circular earpiece that sits over top of the veil, I want that to be an actual perfect circle. So I used the marquee tool set to ellipse mode to create that selection, and then filled that in on a new layer. Now I can simply lock the transparency of that layer, paint the details of the earpiece, and now I'm free to paint the veil, the face, and the hair behind this earpiece without ever having to worry about messing up the silhouette of this perfect ellipse. This is a good example of why layers are so helpful for digital painting, as you can use them to establish very clean shapes and selections, and if your shapes are clean and well preserved, the actual process of painting over top of them becomes significantly faster. If I weren't using layers here, and I decided I wanted to adjust the hair underneath, I would either have to be extremely careful to not paint over top of the elliptical earpiece, or I would have to paint the hair over the earpiece, and then repaint the earpiece on top. That's simply inefficient, and in a professional setting, we don't have time for inefficiency. So using layers is really just about finding ways that you can make your process faster. The more efficient you are with your painting process, the more paintings you can get done, and that's always a good thing. Moving on to painting the skulls and the antlers, you can see that I began by grabbing a soft brush and a medium value and lightly painting over top of the entire layer with the transparency lock on. A lot of beginners struggle with the transitional stage from drawing to painting, as they're not entirely sure what to do with their drawing layer and how to integrate that into their final painting. You can approach this however you find most helpful. Some artists like to create their silhouette underneath their drawing layer and keep the drawing separate so they can turn the drawing on and off. But for me, I find it more helpful to merge the drawing layer with my actual painting layers. That way I never have to worry about losing the drawing, and I can simply paint the drawing directly into the painting. That's why I started painting this headdress by lightly painting a mid-tone value over top of it. By painting that mid-tone value, I removed the pure black lines that were on top of this headdress and reduced the contrast overall to a similar place. This means I still have my drawing on this layer as a guideline, and as I paint over top of it, the drawing will naturally melt into the painting. I personally find this the fastest and most efficient way to transition from drawing to painting, but there are other methods too, so feel free to experiment and see what feels good to you. As I'm painting the headdress, I'm keeping in mind all the concepts we've discussed before. I'm trying to keep the values of different materials very separated, so the skin and the hair is all lighter values than the veil, and I also want to keep the skulls a lighter value than the veil. This will create clear overlaps and a nice stacking of light on dark shapes that will add clarity and impact to our painting. As I move into the fur that covers her closer shoulder, I begin by selecting that layer, turning my transparency lock off, and using the smudge tool to soften the edge of the selection I made. Since I'm going for a soft-edged material, like fur, it saves me some time to simply soften that edge right off the bat. You could simply paint this by hand, but the smudge tool is also a great way to accomplish this. To paint the fur itself, I'm using the same brush that I used for the hair, but I'm using a different kind of brushstroke pattern. The hair is painted up of long flowing strokes, creating smooth rhythms and long strands. The fur on her shoulder is much shorter, so I'm using shorter strokes and being very mindful of the direction that the fur is traveling in, so I can use those brush strokes to establish perspective. I'm also going to add an additional layer here that I had planned from the start. I use my layers to help me describe overlaps and separate different elements. But sometimes a single element can overlap in multiple ways. For instance, her hair goes behind the fur collar on the left side of the character, but it goes in front of the collar on the right side of the character over the neck. My solution was to keep the head and hair on a layer behind the fur collar, then create a new layer over top of the fur collar to create the final strands that overlap over top of the collar and her chest. If I'm mindful of how I paint this transition, I can make it look completely seamless while preserving my layer structure, which makes editing in the future extremely easy. You can also see this makes it very easy to paint the skull over top of the fur collar, as I initially separated that onto its own layer, and I now have the hair draping over top of it on its own layer. I can lock the transparency of the skull layer and paint it very quickly without having to worry about any of those overlaps. I'm using the same methodology to paint the far collar, and I will then start to establish a little bit of value on the rest of the character. I'm not terribly worried about painting the chest of this character, as a lot of that will eventually be covered up by the beaded necklaces. I already know I want to keep those small details on their own layer, so I want to just roughly block in the values of the chest, and I can adjust them later after adding the necklaces. Moving on to the arm that's holding the bowl, I'm doing the same thing that we've done up to this point. I've locked the transparency to perfectly preserve the selection that I made previously, and then I can simply paint all the various elements with different brushes to get the effect that I need. Anytime I want to edit the silhouette of this layer, for instance getting a soft edge to the fur cuff, I can simply turn off my transparency lock, paint in that edge as needed, and then lock it again to preserve that shape. I like to describe this process a lot like playing chess. You're not just looking at the move in front of you, but rather planning 10 moves ahead. It requires a lot of strategic thinking to efficiently use layers, but with some practice, it becomes fairly easy and an extremely useful tool. For instance, in some paintings, I might consider separating the fingers of her hand off of the bowl behind it. But in this case, I feel like it's not going to help me enough to be worth the time it would take to cleanly select those fingers and cut them onto their own layer. So I'm leaving it as one layer for now. Also remember that you can always merge layers back together if your piece starts getting too complicated, so it's better to use more layers to give yourself options for control than it is to use too few layers and find yourself in a difficult situation later on. On the lower half of the figure, there's a lot of various elements, like the belts, the lighter straps, and the pouch that she has attached to her belt. I could separate all of these elements onto their own layers, but again my goal here is efficiency. These elements are fairly simple in their shape and overlap, and also they're far away from the focal point of my character, so I'm okay with these being a little bit looser and messier, as ultimately they're not as important to the piece as, say, the headdress. I pretty much always have more layers concentrated around the focal area of the piece than I do around secondary elements. Now that I've established the larger elements of the character, I can start to dig into some of the fun details. I'm going to start with the draping beads on the headdress, and I'm definitely going to want to keep these on their own layer. I'm starting by drawing myself some quick gestural guidelines, as this will help me place the details in a meaningful way. I can then create a new layer for the details, grab a color that's easy to see, and simply paint the shape of these details over top of my gestural guide. This is a fairly loose painting, so I don't need these shapes to be entirely perfect. I'm just trying to establish the feeling of these beads draping around. I'm also going to create a second layer for these details that goes behind the portrait, as I want to be able to paint the beads that go behind the skull and the face without having to worry about those edges. There's always more than one way to solve a problem. For instance, if you don't want to bother creating another layer for the beads that go behind the head, you could simply paint them all on one layer and use a layer mask to erase the beads that travel behind the head. Once I've established my shapes and my layers, I follow the same process as before, painting the local value, locking the transparency, and then painting the lighting and rendering on top. Now I'm going to start on the transparent fabric that drapes off of the headdress. I'm going to keep this on its own layer as well. If I paint this transparent cloth on top of the face, and then later decide I want to adjust the face in any way, it'll be extremely tedious to try and adjust the face under and around these small wispy dark shapes that I've added. Also, by keeping these on their own layer, I can very easily get the nice transparent effect that this fabric has, as I can either paint with a low pen pressure on my brush to get an actually transparent brush stroke, or I can erase out or adjust the opacity of the layer to get the transparency that I want. So for all of this fabric, I'm using the lasso tool to establish the basic shape that I want to create. Then I'm painting over top with the brush tool and a very subtle pen pressure to get a slightly transparent dark shape, and then I can simply paint in some of the edges and details on top of that. As I go through this, some of the edges of this fabric will become too hard, and you'll see me using the smudge tool to soften them out where needed. I'm also periodically using free transform and warp to adjust the shape of some of these fabrics, which is extremely easy because everything on this painting is very cleanly separated out, so I can adjust the fabric without having to worry about messing up anything else. After the fabric, I'm going to go ahead and tackle the necklaces that she's wearing, using the same process that I used for the beads on the headdress, drawing some gestural lines to establish a guide for my shapes, painting those shapes on a new layer, then filling them with a mid-tone value and painting my lights and shadows on top of that. I have one more tricky detail to add after these beaded elements, and that's the chainmail that drapes over top of her face. This would be a very tricky element to paint by hand, so I've decided to simply create a brush preset to do it for me. By observing how the pattern works in the reference, I can determine what kind of brush I'll need. So I simply make a ring shape on its own layer, erase out half of it, copy that to a new document, define it as a brush preset, then adjust the spacing, apply some size control with pen pressure, and set the angle control to follow the direction of my brush. It took me less than 3 minutes to create this chainmail brush and then quickly paint in the shapes of this chainmail on their own layer. That's way faster than if I tried to do all of this by hand, and a great example of why digital tricks can really speed up your workflow. After I've established the shape of the chainmail, I can lock the transparency, paint the values over top, and then even duplicate the chainmail, turn it black, and blur it to create the shadows underneath. Another great reason to use layers is it allows you to easily fix problems. Towards the end of this, I realized that her arm felt a little bit short, so I simply selected the elbow, cut and paste it onto its own layer, adjusted it with the free transform tool, and then painted the transition underneath. Because the front arm was completely separated onto its own layer, I don't have to worry about this change affecting the chest or the cape behind it. All in all, that change took me probably only 5 minutes. If this character was all on a single layer, it probably would have been at least 10. That might not seem like a big difference, but when you make hundreds of these adjustments over the course of a painting, those spare 5 minutes can really add up and slow down your efficiency. I hope this has given you some good insight into the power that layers provide us in digital painting, and I'd encourage you to experiment with using them to speed up the process of your own paintings. You don't have to follow exactly the same kind of structure that I've shown in this demo. I'd recommend you try it, as you might find it helpful, but ultimately every artist will have their own process and their own preferred way of using layers. There's a lot of different ways to approach using layers, so it's important for you to find the approach that feels good with your process and makes things easier and faster for you. So give it a try and see how it can help you. It may be difficult at first, but with practice and patience, layers are an extremely powerful and useful tool that make digital art the most competitive medium in the industry. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.